السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين حمدا يوافي نعمه ويكافئ مزيده. اللهم لك الحمد كما ينبغي لجلال وجهك ولعظيم سلطانك. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك النبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما كثيرا. اللهم طهر قلوبنا من النفاق وأعمالنا من الرياء وألسنتنا من الكذب وعيوننا من الخيانة فإنك تعلم خائنة الأعين وما تخفي الصدور. آمين. Alhamdulillah. We continue our study of this text, Mataratul Qulub, the Purification of the Hearts, by Sheikh Muhammad Mawlud al-Yaqubi rahimahullah ta'ala. And last week we were talking about the disease of riya, or showing off. And we learned his definition of riya and the different forms of riya, what causes riya, and we looked at the theoretical or the nadari aspect of how to get rid of riya. And today, inshallah, we look at the practical way of removing riya, or showing off. Before I pick up where we left off, though, a question was in my head this morning, and I wanted to ask it. This text of Sheikh Muhammad Mawlud, he begins by speaking about the diseases of the heart, and then in the second half of the book, he talks about the beautiful qualities to cultivate in the heart. So the question is this: why speak about the negative things first before the positive things? Why would he choose to speak about the diseases before speaking about the spiritual virtues? Aywa, at-takhliyah before tahliyah. So you have these two concepts that in tazkiyatun nafs, or purification of the soul, there is removing the bad, and then there is adorning one's heart with the virtues, with the good. But why start with the bad? And the answer is given by in an analogy that we can develop it further. Imam al-Ghazali gives the analogy, but we can develop it further, and I think I mentioned it before. Imagine you have a factory, and this factory produces a lot of toxic waste. And there's a stream leaving from the factory going into a pond. Now, before the factory was there, with this toxic waste produced, the pond was very clear. You could fish inside of there. You could see to the bottom. It was very clear and pure, pristine. But now that the factory is there bringing in this toxic waste, the toxic waste has accumulated inside of the pond. If the person wants to clean the pond, they have to get rid of the toxic waste first. You can't just start populating it with fish. You can't just bring fresh fish and dump it into the pond hoping that they'll flourish, because they're going to die. So the idea is that you have to remove the bad, and then from there you can add the good. Now, it's a little more complicated in human hearts, meaning you're cultivating virtue while also trying to remove the bad. But we focus on the bad because we want to get rid of the things that are blocking our spiritual progress and focus on those things, so that when we add the virtues have a clean place to reside. So Sheikh Muhammad Mawlud talks about the diseases of the heart first, and then the virtues. Last week we were talking about the riya, and we said it takes 2 sessions, maybe even more, because it is such a difficult disease of the heart to come to terms with. And we spoke about it last week as ostentation, showing off, doing things that are supposed to be for Allah Ta'ala, but doing them for other than Allah Ta'ala. Now, according to Sheikh Muhammad Mawlud, this disease of riya stems from 3 things. Number 1 is loving the praise of other people, wanting to be praised by others, number 1. Number 2 is to try to avoid their blame, their criticism, and so on. And the third, he says, is seeking some worldly benefit. So at the essence, riya is really to seek status in the hearts of other people. Because all of those 3 things have one thing in common. when you try to get the praise of other people, or to avoid their criticism, or seek something, some worldly benefit that they have access to, if you get status in their heart, then you have access to these things. You get their praise, you avoid their criticism, or you have access to something of the dunya that they may have. So we discussed last week the signs of Riya. We mentioned Ibn Hamdun and his Hashiyah on Ibn Mayara, who mentions that there's Riya in the body, there's Riya in one's body language, there can be Riya in the way we speak or the things that we do. There's many different forms, the garments we wear, statements we make, and so on. And he talked about the levels of Riya. They're not all the same. He said if you have the Riya, which is showing off as a means to something haram. So if showing off is a wasila, a means, if it's a means to something haram, then it's the worst kind of Riya. And he says this is like a person who shows off, who pretends to be really pious, so that they can acquire the wealth of an orphan that someone may entrust to them to look after. And they're going to consume that. Ekulu mal yatim. They're going to consume the wealth that's for orphans. This is obviously haram. So you're using a haram as a means to haram, right? The other form, he says, is using riya, which is haram, as a means to something that is mubah, that's neutral in itself, such as pretending to be pious so that someone will like you and offer their daughter to you in marriage, right? And then there's other forms, showing off for fear of criticism and so on. Now, the cure, the work, he mentions two forms of cure. He mentions the cure that is nadari, or theoretical, which is ilmi. It's something that you should know and really take to heart. And through that knowledge, it should transform you so that you avoid the riya. And then there's the amali, the practical things you can do to get rid of this disease of riya. The ilmi part we discussed last week, and we said that that is truly knowing, not just intellectually, but truly knowing لا نافع ولا ضار إلا الله, that there's no one who can bring benefit or harm except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. To really know that. And as Muslims, we all know that. You can't be a Muslim without affirming that there is no one who brings benefit ultimately or harm except Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But to make that go from the intellectual affirmation to the heart-based knowledge and certainty of it, that's a different matter altogether. The second cure that's theoretical is just being conscious of the harms of riya. When you think about the dangers of riya, when you go over the ayat that mention riya, or the ahadith in which the Prophet ﷺ warns against riya, the more you think about these things, the more that this disease will be ugly in your eyes. And the uglier it is to you, the more likely you are to avoid it. So those two are nadari, they're theoretical or they're ilmi based. What about the practical cures? Now he gives us a lot here. He says, after describing the theoretical, دواؤه العلمي وستر العمل عن أعين الناس الدواء العملي. He says that is the theoretical treatment, what we just said, and veiling one's actions from the eyes of others is its practical treatment. So practical treatment number one, concealing our good deeds from the eyes of other people. This is what he says. Now, you have to address these three causes in order to really get to the bottom of it. So again, the three causes: loving the praise of others, trying to avoid their criticism, or seeking something of the world, coveting something of the dunya. So the remedy for riya is really the same as the remedy for love of status. Hubbul jah wal manzila 'inda an-nas. Loving status in the eyes of people. So you conceal actions as a spiritual remedy. And the way you do that is you grow accustomed to doing acts of ibadah alone, concealed from the eyes of other people. And you should, the Salaf used to say that one should conceal their righteous actions just as they conceal their sins. Conceal the righteous actions just as you would conceal the sins. Does that mean that this is an absolute to be taken in every situation? No. There are situations where it is preferable, advisable, recommended for a person to do certain things publicly. You can't pray Jama'ah except in Jama'ah. You can't pray Jum'ah except with the Jama'ah. You can't do many different acts of worship except in a congregational setting, because our deen is a very social deen, and many of the acts of worship that we do as Muslims are in a social setting. They're not done alone. But then there are things that we can do by ourselves. Nevertheless, the ulama mention that there are situations where a person should not conceal their actions. So they say, for instance, parents should pray in the view of their children. Why would you hide your salah from your children? You're praying in the eye of your children, in their view, so that they see you praying, so that they connect to salat, and hopefully they pray with you, or at the very least they see you in prayer, and they see that as a norm in the household. If you are a teacher, then it is recommended for you to do certain things publicly in the view of your students. In fact, the ulama would say that for the mashayikh, certain things that are better done secretly, for them, they're better done publicly. Because if people are emulating them and taking them as an example, their public performance of that righteous action is a means of guiding other people. And even one of the ulama said, if you want to know the remedy to riyā, intend in your salah, when doing it publicly, that you're teaching people how to pray properly. They say, if you feel that maybe you're inclined to show off in your prayer, just have the intention that I'm also teaching people how to pray properly. Giving sadaqah publicly as an encouragement for others to give sadaqah. That is hopefully not riyā, and a person does that publicly to encourage others. So a parent, a sheikh, someone in a position of authority who is emulated should do certain things publicly so that others follow them. So the ideal is that we take a bit of an assessment. We see, is there this incongruence between our public acts of ibadah and our private ones? For example, salat. If we find that our salat is very rushed and scattered, and we're doing excessive movement and we're not really focused and it's quick when we're by ourselves, but when we're in the masjid, we're praying very properly and slowly, there's a discrepancy here. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're showing off, because the environment sometimes inspires us, but we should try to make our private acts of devotion equal to or superior to the quality of them done publicly. So a person would, addressing riyā, they would try to pray either just as they pray publicly, or make the prayer even longer when they're by themselves. And this becomes a practical way of training the heart to avoid the riyā. That's the first practical cure. The second practical cure, he says, وَصُورَةُ الْإِخْلَاصِ فِي الْإِكْثَارِ مِنْهَا وَمِنْ سَيِّدِ الْإِسْتِغْفَارِ, as is frequent recitation of Surah Al-Ikhlas and the master supplication for forgiveness. So there's two things here: reciting Surah Al-Ikhlas frequently, and also reciting the master dua for forgiveness. What is the master dua for forgiveness? Does anyone know? Aywa. Allahumma anta rabbi, la ilaha illa ant, khalaqtani, wa ana abduka, wa ana ala ahdika, wa wa'adika mastata'at, ila akhir dua. This dua in Sahih al-Bukhari and other collections, the Prophet ﷺ called it Sayyidul Istighfar, the master dua for seeking forgiveness. This is a very powerful dua, and there's lots of lessons in it. In fact, there's ulama who have even written entire books just explaining the different meanings contained in this dua. So he says, this is another practical way. Just recite Surah Al-Ikhlas frequently and Sayyid al-Istighfar frequently. And this is because Surah Al-Ikhlas is mujarrab, meaning it is one of the tried and true remedies for treating the heart from the disease of riyā. He says, لِزَمَنِ الْقَلْبِ مِنَ الرِّيَاءِ يُلْغَى دَوَاؤُهُ أَيَّمَا دَوَائِ. As for the chronically diseased heart that results from showing off one's good works, it too will find a cure in this, and what a cure. So he's saying, if you do this, you'll find a very powerful cure. Do not underestimate the power of the Quran in certain chapters in their transformative effect in changing the heart from one that seeks the pleasure and praise of others and one that only seeks the pleasure of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, Imam Ahmad Zarruq al-Fasi al-Burnusi rahimahullah, a very famous scholar of North Africa, he has a book called An-Nasihatul Kafiya liman khassahu Allahu bil-Afiyah. This is a book on purification of the heart. And Sheikh Ahmad Zarruq, he says, and I quote, whoever desires ikhlas, sincerity, should recite frequently Qul huwallahu ahad, and should say daily 3 times in the morning and the evening, Allahumma inni a'udhu bika an ushrika bika wa ana a'lam wa astaghfiruka min kulli ma la a'lam. O Allah, I seek refuge in you that I associate partners with you whilst knowing, and I seek your forgiveness from everything that I am not aware of. So this is drawn from the hadith in Imam al-Bukhari's Al-Adab al-Mufrad. The Prophet ﷺ taught us to make the dua of seeking Allah's forgiveness and seeking His refuge from riyah that we are aware of and the subtle riyah that we may not even be aware of. He says, recite Surah Ikhlas, say this dua frequently 3 times in the morning and the evening. It's a practical cure for the disease of riyah, showing off. Now, his practical cures revolve around these 2 things: concealing our devotions, making them private, and reciting Surah Ikhlas frequently and Sayyidul Istighfar frequently. But now he goes into masail, different issues related to riyah and getting to the bottom of this. He says, أَمَا الرِّيَاءُ بِسَتْرِ ذَنْبٍ أَوْ خَنَى فَوَاجِبٌ كَمَا إِبْنُ زُكْرِ بَيَّنَا. As for a type of hypocrisy that involves concealing one's wrong actions or some impropriety, sexual impropriety, this is in fact an obligation, as Ibn Zukri elucidated. So what he's telling us here is that it is not riyah, it is not showing off if you conceal your sins. It is not. It's in fact praiseworthy, and it's an indication of iman. That Muslim who struggles with certain sins. Maybe he likes to go to the nightclub. Nasallallahu al-afiyah. But when he goes to the nightclub, as soon as he parks in the parking lot, he takes off his kufi. Why would he take off his kufi? Because there's this iman in the heart. He feels a bit ashamed, and he kind of conceals his identity by doing so. There's something in that. He's doing something haram, but he's trying to conceal it. That itself is praiseworthy. Now, is it hypocrisy? It is hypocrisy in the sense of a person trying to pretend that they are something they are not. But concealing one's sins is not necessarily hypocrisy in and of itself. It's praiseworthy. And Imam Ibn Zukri, whom he cites, he says in his commentary on An-Nasihatul Kafiya of Sheikh Ahmad Zarruq, he says that one should hide their sins, and that if the sultan, the leader, took them and asked them, did you do sin XYZ? He says that person can say no, even if they did it. So imagine a person did haram XYZ, and they concealed it from others. And then someone in authority takes them and says, did you do XYZ? Ibn Zukri, quoting Imam Ahmad Zarruq, says, that person can say no, even though technically that's not true. He says the reason why is because publicizing, making open one's fahisha, one's sinful actions, is itself a kind of fahisha, and one is entitled to protect their honor in such a case, even if it is lying. So there's a virtue in concealing our faults. So he mentions that as a side issue. Now he talks about the different forms. the different forms of riya. He says, أَمَّا الْمُبَاحُ فَالتَّجَمُّلُ بِهِ يَدُورُ بَيْنَ مَنْعِهِ وَنَدْبِهِ. As for what relates to the permissible, adorning oneself with it falls between recommended and prohibited. So he's talking about riya that is not riya showing off in ibadah, but showing off in some other forms. He says, as for what relates to the permissible, adorning oneself with it falls between recommended and prohibited. He explains, لِطَلَبِ الْعِلْمِ وَإِظْهَارِ النِّعَمِ نَدْبٌ كَذَا لِمَنْ عَلَى أَخٍ قَدِمٍ. For the seeker of knowledge, or someone desiring to show the blessings of wealth, it is recommended. Included in this is someone visiting a brother for the sake of Allah, كَكُلِّ قَصْدٍ حَسَنٍ وَأَنْ تَؤُمْ بِهِ اخْتِيَانًا أَوْ مُبَاهَةً حَرُمٍ. Or any other well-intended deed for that matter, unless you desire thereby haughtiness or boastful competition, then it will be considered prohibited. What is he saying here? He's telling us that if you desire to dress nicely, is it a kind of showing off? Well, yes. Why? You're dressing for others. You're dressing in a certain way to be seen by others, to look nice for other people. And he's saying dressing nicely in itself is not riya. Imam Abdul Walid al-Baji, the great Maliki scholar, said that Sayyidina Umar radiallahu anhu liked that the people of ilm and piety dress nicely. It was recommended. And the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam before him, of course, says that Inna Allah jamilun yuhibbul jamal. Allah is beautiful and loves beauty, and He loves to see the effects of His blessings upon people. So this is why you find in most parts of the Muslim majority world, you have people, ulama, have often a very distinctive form of dress. Why do they do that? In the early times, the Sahaba themselves did not have a distinctive form of dress. The fuqaha among the Sahaba, the people of fatwa among the Sahaba, did not have a distinctive form of dressing. But in the latter generations, the ulama would dress in a distinctive way. And in many of the Muslim majority regions, anyone who was from Ahlul Bayt tended to dress in a certain distinctive way. And in those same places, merchants dress in a distinctive way. Why did they do this? It was because if you recognize this person as an alim, as a scholar, you know that this is a person you can go to for questions. You also give them the respect that is due to them as an alim of the deen. And so dressing nicely is something recommended. As for dressing up nicely when you go visit your brother, as Sheikh Muhammad Maulud says, this is actually from the Salaf. Imam Abu Aliya, one of the Imams of the Salaf, he said, when the Muslims of old would visit one another, they would adorn themselves. They would not just show up wearing tattered clothes and sweatpants. They would dress nicely when they would go to someone's house. They would wear something that is tasteful, fashionable, and nice because they're presenting themselves to someone and they're honoring that person by dressing nicely. And that is not showing off because the person is not doing an act of ibadah to be seen by that person and acquire their praise. They're just looking nice. So, after talking about these things, he now pivots into a very important discussion. And this is how he concludes this text. He talks now about an issue that you don't really find talked about that often in public discourse about showing off. And that is, what is the ruling on doing acts of worship for the sake of some worldly benefit or some benefit in the hereafter? Now he gives us the examples. We'll mention them and then explain. He says, وَلَهُمُ فِي السَّعْيِ بِالتَّعَبُّدِ لِنَفْعِ الْآنِ لَا إِدِّخَارًا لِغَدِ أو لغد أو مع استحلاء قولان بالإخلاص والرياء. Scholars, he says, are of two opinions about seeking benefit in this life through ibadah, as opposed to seeking only the hereafter, or even seeking the hereafter or worship seeking its delights Is it sincerity or showing off? So here's three issues here. Issue number one, seeking a worldly benefit through an act of ibadah. You're not showing off for a human being, but you are seeking a worldly benefit through an act of worship. That's number one. Number two, seeking a reward in the hereafter through an act of ibadah. Number three, seeking this feeling of delight and joy, the spiritual vibe, the person gets when they do some act of ibadah, some joy that may arise in the heart in acts of worship. Now, there's a lot of discussion among the ulama about whether these are considered riya or not. And he says, lahum qawlan. There's two views among the ulama about this. Why do they have two views? The reason why the ulama have two views about this, some saying yes and some saying no, it goes back to their definition of riya. We say whenever you discuss with someone anything, you have to define your terms. And there's different ways that riya has been defined. So according to the fuqaha, the jurists, they define riya as doing an ibadah to be seen by others, because the riya is from ru'ya, to be seen. So the fuqaha will say that riya is to do an act of ibadah to be seen by other people. However, other ulama, ulama al-qulub, ulama al-tazkiyah, those who focus on matters of the heart, they give a broader definition of riya. And this is why there's a difference. They say that riya is al-amal li ghayrillah. Any act of worship that is for other than Allah. They keep it a lot broader than the definition of the fuqaha. So literally any act of devotion for other than Allah Ta'ala is considered riya by those scholars. And that would include doing things for aghrad dunyawiyya or ukhrawiyya. Doing things for ulterior motives linked to this dunya or even to the hereafter. Now, what are some examples? Example number one, seeking a worldly benefit. The Prophet ﷺ says in the sound hadith that whoever recites Surah Al-Waqi'ah will be protected from poverty. It's a very well-known hadith. Reciting Surah Al-Waqi'ah is a remedy, a means of averting poverty. So, if a person recites Surah Al-Waqi'ah with the intention of averting poverty, is it for the sake of other than Allah? This is an important question. If it is, then how do we understand this hadith and others like it? Because the Prophet ﷺ is explicitly saying that it has a worldly benefit for the one who recites Surah Al-Waqi'ah and other chapters. So that's example number one, doing an act of ibadah for some worldly benefit. Example number two, which is doing an act of ibadah for an otherworldly and afterworldly benefit. This is the person who hears of the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, whoever builds a masjid for Allah, what is the reward? Allah shall build for them a house in Jannah. So this person donates money, he oversees the construction of a masjid, and his intention is he wants real estate in paradise. So this is intending that real estate in paradise. Is that considered riyah as well? So this is something that the ulama explore. Is it for Allah or is it for the house? You see? That's the second one. So worldly benefit, after worldly benefit, and the third example, istihla, which is seeking some joy or delight that arises from the act of ibadah. This is the person, for example, who prays qiyamul layl by themselves at night. They get up when everyone's sleeping. The light is very dim. They make wudu and they're praying and they're making dua and munajat and they're feeling this spiritual high from the experience. And that's what they're after. They like that feeling. They like that hal, that state when they're in qiyamul layl. If they are motivated if their motivation is to acquire that feeling, that state, Are they doing it for Allah Ta'ala, or are they doing it for the vibe, for the feeling? These are the questions. Now, what are the answers? Now, the answers, going back to number one, the person who recites Surah Al-Waqi'ah to avert poverty or seeking some other worldly benefit. According to Imam Al-Ghazali, this is considered doing something لِغَيْرِ for other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And he actually gives his own story, not related to the hadith, but similar. He tells us that in his younger days, he came across a hadith. Now, it's not actually a hadith, it's an athar from Sa'id bin Musayyib, which says, whoever is sincere for Allah Ta'ala in all of their actions for 40 days, Allah Ta'ala will open for them Yanabi'ul Hikmah, the well springs of wisdom in their heart. So he hears this athar from Sa'id bin Musayyib, and he commits to practicing this. So he said, for 40 days, I made sure that every single thing I did was sincerely for Allah, not showing off, not seeking anybody's praise. 40 days straight, I did all of this ibadah lillah. And after 40 days, guess what? There were no well springs of wisdom emerging from his heart. He was no different from when he started. This puzzled him. He said, where are these well springs of wisdom? I'm the same as I was before. So he goes to one of his teachers and he complains. He says, Ya Sheikh, I acted on that narration. I made sure I was sincere for 40 days, but there's no wisdom. Nothing's new. And the Sheikh, as we would say today, he kind of proverbially pulled the rug up underneath his feet. And he said to him, oh, well, that's because for 40 days, nothing you did was sincere for the sake of Allah. He says, how? Kaif? He said, because you were doing acts of ibadah that are supposed to be for Allah, but you used the ibadah for Allah as a means to something else. Meaning, your ibadah of Allah had a gharad. It was an ulterior motive. You were looking for the wisdom. It wasn't for Allah alone. Meaning, you're after the wisdom. You're not after the pleasure of Allah in that. So he's telling him, you have to redirect your focus. So this is according to Imam Al-Ghazali. He says, no. However, there were some dissenting views. Imam Al-Qarafi and others say that this is not done for other than the sake of Allah, because if a person recites Surah Al-Waqi'ah, for instance, to avert poverty, and by averting poverty, they have material comfort, and that is used as an aid for ibadah and obedience and benefiting themselves and their dependents and helping their family, being safe from needing to ask others, then all of that is ikhlas, because you're seeking al-istighna' an-nas. You're seeking from the wealth, the aversion of poverty, to be independent so that you can focus on ibadah. So Imam al-Qarafi says, no, you can have a sound intention even if technically you are seeking something of the world, because the world here becomes the means for more focus in ibadah. So there's some dissenting views here. So that's example number one. Now example number two, the person who builds a masjid for Allah and they're seeking a house in Jannah. They want al-hur wal-qusur. They want the maidens and the real estate. This is a long debated issue among the ulama. They say that worshipping with the intention of entering Jannah is permissible even if it is not as superior to worshipping Allah because simply huwa al-mustahiq lil-ibadah, because he deserves worship. And we have the athar from Imam Ali that kind of clarifies this. Imam Ali radiallahu anhu said that there's three types of people who engage in ibadah. You have the ibadah of the abid, meaning those who have the worship of the slaves, meaning they only do ibadah to avoid the punishment of Allah in the hereafter. They're just trying to avoid the whip. That's the only reason they do anything. They don't want to go to hell. That's it. They're not even thinking about Jannah. They just don't want to go to hell. They're so frightened of hell, and so they obey Allah. And this is the lowest level. Then he says you have the ibadah of the tujjar, the worship of the merchants. And these are the people who are worshiping Allah Ta'ala because they want hur and qusur, they want the real estate in paradise, they have their their ajr calculator out. Oh, I prayed 8 rak'ahs here, 10 rak'ahs there, I gave this. They're calculating all this ajr and they're thinking about all the things in paradise being built for them. He says, this is the ibadah of the tujjar. And then he says, higher than them, the third level is the ibadah of the ahrar, the worship of the free person. And that is the one who worships Allah Ta'ala because لِأَنَّهُ هُوَ اللَّهُ subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because He is Allah. And how do you know if you're from this one or that one? Simple question. Would the person, if, and we say basically as a theoretical, right? نفترض, right? افتراضا. If there was no reward for that and there was no threat of hell, would they still worship Allah? How many people would pray salat if there was no hell to avoid and no paradise to acquire? Would they still worship Allah because He is the creator of the heavens and the earth? Right? If the ibadah is lillah wa billah, because He is the one deserving worship, that is the ibadah of the ahrar. Now, all of these three are upon good, but some are superior to others. So this is what he's getting at. So, ihtisab, right? Man sama Ramadan imanan wa ihtisaba, ghufira lahu ma taqaddama min dhanbi. Whoever fasts in Ramadan out of iman and ihtisab. This ihtisab is this anticipation of reward, or this anticipation seeking Allah's pleasure, having a good opinion of Allah, that Allah Ta'ala will be pleased with them. There's levels to this. So it's not showing off by any means, but there are levels to sincerity. Now the last one is probably the most important of these, because he says doing ibadah for some worldly benefit, that's the kind of the motive, or ibadah for some afterworldly benefit. The last one is ibadah istihla'an, basically seeking the joy and delight that comes into the heart when they're in ibadah. So this literally means to seek delight and enjoyment. It is to do an act of ibadah to get the, what they coined in the early 2000s, the iman rush, right? Or to get the spiritual vibe, to have that feeling of closeness to Allah Ta'ala. Now, according to the ulama, this would be blameworthy if that is the primary motivation. Why? Because states, experiences come and go. If a person is worshiping Allah Ta'ala because of the feeling, well, what happens when the feeling doesn't come? Do they give up their ibadah? The person who says, I'm not feeling it, right? There are times when you are in salat and it's like you're in Jannah because of the munajat and the state of closeness you feel to your Lord. And there are times when you don't have that feeling. You still pray. You don't give up prayer because you say, oh, my heart's not in it, I'm not feeling the vibe. So seeking the feeling itself can be a trap of the nafs, where the person is doing it for the feeling and the emotional experience, and not because Allah Ta'ala commands it, whether your heart feels in it or not. Now, one of the early Imams, Abu Imad al-Wasiti al-Hanbali, he says, "Istihla at-ta'at sumumun qatila." He says, this feeling of seeking the vibe in acts of obedience is a deadly poison. Not that you feel it. Feeling it is good. But seeking it and making it the primary motivation, it's a deadly poison because it's a trap of the nafs. What happens if you don't get the feeling? We're not fair weather friends. The fair weather friend is the one who they're around when times are good, and when times are bad, they're not around. We don't want to be fair weather friends with Allah Ta'ala. We want to be with Allah Ta'ala in good times and bad, whether we have that feeling, whether we don't have that feeling. And sometimes Allah will test you if you have those feelings, and sometimes they'll be removed. It's a test. Do you continue in your obedience? Or do you give them up because the feeling isn't there? So we have to be mindful of this. So if that's the reason for the consistency, then it's a disease. Now, any ibadah will bring some form of joy, but there's different levels to this. Now he concludes here. والمستحب لشعور الناس بسعيه رائي لدى أناس والنجم لم يرى به من باس أن بني السعي على أساس. He concludes the next two lines. He says, some consider that merely taking delight in people's awareness of one's actions is showing off. Though the Najm, the star, Imam Malik, did not consider that harmful as long as the original intention was based on the foundation of sincerity. So here's another issue where the scholars differed. Some of them say that one who takes joy from others knowing about their ibadah, knowing about their good deeds, is also a kind of mora'i, a kind of show-off. Although in this case it's retroactive or posthumously, it's after the act of worship. However, others, like Imam Malik, held that no, as long as the intention in the beginning was sound, if they take any joy and praise from others afterwards, that's not going to affect their original intention. So, this is the view of Imam Malik ibn Anas rahimahullah, who is called here al-Najm, because the ulama in the past would say, إِذَا ذُكِرَ الْعُلَمَاء فَإِمَام مَالِكْ نَجْمُهُمْ. That when the scholars are mentioned, Imam Malik is the star. He said, as long as your original intention is pure, if you experience any delight or joy when people praise you after the fact, that doesn't affect your original intention. In fact, the Prophet ﷺ himself said that when a person is praised by other believers, this is the bushra, the glad tidings that comes early. The early glad tidings before the glad tidings of the hereafter. So Imam Malik was asked, what do you say about a man who comes to the masjid and thinks to himself that he hopes others see him? And Imam Malik did not see anything wrong with that as long as his original intention was sincere, because what we are responsible for is what we do, what we acquire, not the passing thoughts. Okay? So he concludes, last line, وَعَمَدٌ عَلَى رِيَاءٍ أَفْضَلُ من تركه لخوفه وفضلوا ذكر اللسان فارغ الجنان على الغفور القلب واللسان. He says, in fact, deeds that are done while showing off are better than abandoning them out of the fear of showing off. Similarly, scholars have preferred the remembrance of Allah on the tongue with a heedless heart over a heedless heart and a tongue combined. Two issues. A person should not get so fearful of showing off that it causes them to leave off ibadah, to leave off ta'ah, obedience to Allah Ta'ala. They have to push through, fight their nafs, purify the intention, work through it, and not fall to the trap of shaitan telling him, listen, you're not sincere, you're a show-off, don't even bother. That's a trap as well. And he here alludes to the statement of Ibn Ata'illah, who said that do not give up your dhikr of Allah Ta'ala because you don't feel that your heart is present. Because it is better to be heedless while you are engaged in dhikr than to be heedless of dhikr altogether. Because dhikr is of the tongue and in the heart. Ideally, these are combined. But if a person is feeling that, okay, they're just repeating the words on their tongue, their heart isn't there, does that mean they should give it up? No. He says, no, continue to do the dhikr bil lisan, with your tongue, even if your heart is not there. Because it is better to have dhikr of the tongue without the heart than to have neither dhikr of the heart nor the tongue. And this is why ideally we combine them, but it's better to have one than the other. Because Ibn Ata'illah says, it is better to be ghafil fi dhikri, to be heedless or to be absent-minded while in the dhikr of Allah, than to be ghafil an dhikr, to be heedless from dhikr altogether. So this is how he concludes this section on الرياء. And I began with the dua, Allahumma tahir qulubana min al-nifaq, which means, oh Allah, purify our hearts from hypocrisy, showing off. وَأَعْمَالنا مِنَ الرِّيَاءِ, our actions from ostentation. وَأَلْسِنَتَنَا مِنَ الْكَذِبِ, and our tongues from lying. وَعُيُونَنَا مِنَ الْخِيَانَةِ, and our eyes from the deception of the eyes. فَإِنَّكَ تَعْلَمُ خَائِنَةَ الْأَعْيُنِ وَمَا تُخْفِي الصُّدُورِ, for you know the deception of the eyes and what is concealed in the hearts. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم والحمد لله رب العالمين وجزاكم الله عنا خيرا. بارك الله فيك. اللهم صل.